So, Alexander Clarkson, professor of international relations at
European Studies,
European Studies, King's College London. Alex defended his PhD in Oxford.
Yes, originally in Oxford, yeah.
And then taught at Oxford and then switched to London. And Alex specializes on migration, security issues, and social movements as well.
Yeah, but yeah, I'll explain. I'll give you the outline.
So Alex is writing for us a chapter for one of the volumes that we're preparing for publication. Alex is writing a chapter on the green parties and green movements in England, Scotland, and Wales.
Yeah. I
was just working on the peer review of our book proposal just today morning. I was working, and this peer reviewer, that was basically the only suggestion, the only constructive suggestion that he or she made was that it should be not only you're familiar with this, the movements in England and Scotland.
Yeah,
and there should be also Wales.
I can guess you that.
So I'm sure you want.
What about Northern Ireland?
I already.
That's a separate. Oh God, you don't even want to go into Irish politics.
I assured them that you will do that. So it's already done. Please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on a Thursday afternoon on 5:30. So, in terms of my research, it's just important to clarify where this is coming from. 50% of what I do relates to diasporas and the study of diasporas and diaspora politics. It's, by the way, where the study of the green stuff, of the green politics stuff comes. It's stuff work I'm more in a knot. Sometimes it's good to keep your oar in and stay focused on that. Though this talk will not actually deal with those issues, because the other half of what I do is driven by my teaching. So it's a very British higher education experience. So I got hired because of the work on migration, diasporas, European politics, and I arrived the first day in my new department at King's College London, and they said, "Can you teach European security?" I was like, "What? It's not nothing to do with European security." I'm like, "No, here you are. You're new. This is your module." Like, thanks, guys. So out of that came an attempt, a slightly desperate attempt to link all of these different themes together, and I think they've kind of linked together the other half of what I do, which is the militarization of EU border policy, right? And that involves, of course, migration, that involves diaspora. It also involves green parties, because one of the interesting tensions we've had throughout the European center-left, particularly green movements, is trying to reconcile pressures on the borders and military and strategic pressures with which is fundamentally a pacifist and environmental tradition. We can see the Green Party in Germany that's gone through a remarkable journey. I've known some of the people involved for a very long time, and it's really fascinating to watch where they were in, I don't know, Palisha and Mustache in 1993 and where they are now. It's quite uncanny. And if you look at the English Green Movement, they're somewhere where the German Greens were in the 1990s. So they're actually beginning to go through that journey as well. And so that all kind of links all these different factors is the issue of how frictions and pressures on the EU's borders do a number of different things. How they connect the domestic politics of the European Union with the politics of neighboring states. How they shape the internal dynamics, the internal integration dynamics of the European Union. And how these various forms of interactions, depending on the geopolitical crisis of the day, economic pressures, throw into question our whole modeling. And this is where I'm coming into this project with colleagues at Nanovic Institute of Notre Dame. There's fantastic people over there who've been doing a lot of thinking about this. It's their European Studies Center there, Notre Dame, about concepts of center and periphery, right? And I have to admit, I started this, they asked me because I've been talking and writing a lot about that 50% of what I do for my job. The diaspora stuff is like mine, and the 50% is for my job. Is it border stuff? Is thinking about the militarization process, thinking about these interactions, how they're putting the EU through what I claim is a state formation process. So I'll just put it's a very controversial claim in my department, particularly in the UK. Although my department's soft compared to, say, doing this towards colleagues in the LSE, who are very much convinced this is not a state in formation, but I'm pretty convinced the European Union is going through a process of state formation. If you took anything else, any other institution, and said it had a parliament, regulatory system, currency, shared border guard, Frontex, and any other shared institutions, you have a European public prosecutor with Laura Kövesi, you'd say, oh, that's state formation. Tilly, Scott Paul, all the theorists of state formation. If you call it the European Union, everybody's like, no, that's not state formation. Right? So I think there's an interesting kind of psychological barrier people have to think about what's happening in terms of a kind of theoretical modeling that we use for any of these processes. And if you look at processes of state formation, one of the spaces in which these processes of state formation begin to gain momentum is on the borders. Right? So one of those spaces as a kind of new territorial, political, imperial, maybe what we're seeing is the formation of an empire, right? A sort of new imperial, democratic empire of liberty, like the Americans used to call the United States. As we see this process taking shape, you see a kind of increasingly clear delineation of territoriality in terms of a collective border and a collective space for all the problems we have with Schengen internally, and maybe we can go into that in the question and answer session. But one of the spaces in which we saw the formation of the United States as a modern political entity was, again, this formation of entities to control and manage movement from one sovereign space to another. Right? The more you become a kind of shared political space, the more controlling movement across that space in terms of good, capital, services, and people. Remember the four freedoms, the Maastricht foundations of the European Union. The more controlling that movement becomes a way of demonstrating that you have control over your internal shared political space that is distinct from the other form of sovereignty on the other side of that space. So the borders are fundamental to any process of shared state formation. And to come to some of the themes we'll discuss today, as a consequence, often political institutions, nations, ethnicities, groups, military institutions, like the Austrians used to call them the Grenze. The Serbs who were bordered along the border, or you'd have Cossacks, so the Ukrainians play for different actors, Crimean Tatars. You have Kurds on the Ottoman Empire imperial border with Safavid Iran, right? These groups play a hugely outsized role in development of entities. According to any kind of model of capital and power, the center should surely have the dominant role. But actually, because the borders are so fundamental to delineating space and power, and the center is so dominant on actors on the supposed periphery, the periphery can become the center. Right? And this is all kind of fundamental and basic, and it's been a critique of Wallersteinian center-periphery models for a very long time. It's very, very interesting that every 5 or 6 or 7 years, you have a wave of articles critiquing an EU-driven center-periphery model that puts Germany and France at the center, and then everybody for the next 10 years puts Germany and France at the center. Right? So it's a little bit of thinking through beyond just arguing the point and thinking through, so if we just simply say, the division between center and periphery is actually much more ambivalent and blurred in the system, it's worth thinking through, how does this work, right? How does this friction on the borders, these pressures on the borders, these different relationships generate a different kind of center-periphery map within the way in which politics, security, political life in the EU is shaped and developed? And how far on the other side of that border, it's a slightly different question. So I did get a good critique from the LSE presenters. They say I'm actually asking two different distinct research questions. I think they're connected, but I do take that on. This is a slightly distinct. Like part B is, how does this process give actors on the other side of that border leverage over the EU system as well? Because you're constantly, for a functioning border system, you have to have cooperation between both sides of that border. Right? If you don't have a functioning partner on the other side of the border, you either have permanent disorder that puts your own territoriality into question, or you're gradually pulled more and more and more in controlling that space. That's how we get imperial expansion over time as well. Because you're constantly trying to create order on the other side in order to demonstrate to your own internal population or internal elites that you have control over your own sovereign space. Right? So an ideal border system is one, and one that functions and stable is one where both sides have enough equilibrium and trust to maintain a degree of control and accept each other's sovereignty and accept each other's controls on both sides of the border. So one of my concerns, by the way, is we've clearly had a breakdown between the EU and Russia, and that opens up questions that go below just, the Russians reenacting Fulda Gap. There's other ways in which the Putin regime can cause a lot of trouble in the Baltics and Finland that we really don't engage with. Sorry, I was just going to use the arrow function, or that. So one of the problems we have is when I do the EU, and when I do EU stuff, everybody kind of thinks they know what the EU is and how it works, but doesn't actually spend a lot of time looking at the institutions. I mean, it's one of the maybe the issues in terms of the way the EU is taught is that it's presented as boring, right? It's dry, boring. Actually, it's really fun. It's really, really interesting. Watching the European Council in action, watching the European Parliament. You know, sometimes it's really fun watching people try to herd cats. There's all kinds of different moving parts. And if you're interested in politics, you should be interested in moving parts. I mean, the macro gets boring after a while, right? You want to know who hates who and why, and which institute can be part of the entity can be a veto player, and how different veto players interact, and how the sausage is made in terms of policy and process. So I think just to go through this process, there's a number of key points to be made in terms of thinking in terms of how these central periphery dynamics, first of all. I think for the first point I want to make is, if we think about this as an interesting sort of variant or rethinking of the way in which you're just fundamentally wired to think in terms of centers and peripheries, is to consider that EU expansion works and is successful because it acts as a process of, some people hate this, some people like deperipheralization. What's the fundamental attraction to EU membership if you're along these borders, right? If we consider, I'll give you one example. I think the current head of the IMF is Bulgarian. Right, you have people from smaller Central and Eastern European states seeded throughout international institutions. Kaja Kallas plays a substantial role in the European and global system. Not a well-defined one, always been the problem with EAS, but is actually becoming an increasingly well-defined one with each person playing that role in terms of the High Representative. Right, and what you get both as an elite and as a voter in a state that becomes part of the EU is you get the option to cease to be a periphery in global terms. That's the killer sale that the EU makes, right? You feel as a small state that you are not listened to, that you have no veto, that you're out, that you're periphery. And the offer that candidacy gives you is to say, we can deperipheralize you. And that's not an offer, for example, Russia can make to anyone. Russia is about submission to the center. Once you are absorbed into the current Russian system, maybe Russia has a more federal future ahead of it, we'll have to see. But once you're absorbed into the Russian system as conceived by Vladimir Putin, or the Soviet system by its predecessor, the Tsar system before, it is fundamentally a centralist system based on border regions being made to submit to a central order with a kind of a civilizational narrative. What's the offer? Why is the offer the EU gives always more attractive? It's more attractive because it makes you a veto player. Now, by making you a veto player, because you have a seat in the European Council, because you have MEPs, so each of these party families, the EPP, the SND, Greens, Renew, each one of them have all these different mini parties within them. That also is the EU's fatal flaw, right? It's slow, it's bureaucratic, it's really, really difficult to get any shit done quickly. You basically, it's the inherent aspect of the EU. One reason I was saying before is, why am I confident about the EU? Because I've seen it go through multiple existential crises and come out. I get stronger usually. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But what's the inherent problem with the EU? It's not very good at getting this stuff done before it ends up in an existential crisis. It always seems to have a gun to its head to actually get moving. Always. And I've looked at, if you look at back to de Gaulle's empty chair crisis of 67, right, various ructions in the 1970s in terms of instabilities in the global order. The fact that new pillars constructed in this process as part of this institution, it becomes more and more like a state. It seems unable to create the kind of preemptive mechanisms needed to avoid the crisis in the first place. And yet that weakness is its core attraction. Why is it so slow? Because it offers each one of its constituent member states power, right? The power to block, to slow down. That doesn't necessarily mean that, say, Estonia is stronger than Germany, right? If you're a smart small state in the EU, if you're not Viktor Orban, like the Irish or the Cypriots, you know when to play that card, right? So the Cypriots will sit back and just allow everything to happen, 90% of things to happen, because they know that if they overplay the veto in the European Council, people start ignoring and going around them. But as long as they make themselves valuable to the system elsewhere, everybody knows there's certain things about relations with Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus that nobody was willing to touch. Because they're veto, they know when to use their veto. Orban just uses the veto over and over and again, and you tickle his tummy and give him cash, and he goes away. And that means that people within Brussels have taken him less and less seriously over the years. I mean, it's very funny how you have this American or British reporting about Orban. And people in Brussels are like, yeah, fuck Orban, whatever. Money, here, go in. Good boy. Right? There's a real discrepancy, actually. It also means that the corruption in Hungary can continue, right? Because it's too easy to buy him off, right? So nobody can really wants to fight because everybody knows if you put out the checkbook and done. Right? So in a sense, Orban isn't stupid either. He knows how to play the game and keep going, right? So the EU expansion, the fundamental attraction is it's a process of deperipheralization. So these processes of enlargement and state formation are fundamentally reordering each neighbor region, including those along the Eastern Mediterranean, in three ways. Now, obviously, as you absorb a member state, if you're like, think of it as an empire, right? If you're an empire that absorbs these member states, but also gives them power within your system, that's what gives you that killer advantage over everyone else. It's a two-way process. You're not just making them more European. With every accession, they're making you more Bulgarian, or you more Greek, or you more Romanian. Your strategic culture is reordered every time you give people new groups of people of power within it. Right? So if you take the Eastern Mediterranean, we have the attraction of the EU accession process is grounded on how it turns states whose agency is viewed as geopolitical peripheral into full players in the governance systems of a global power center. Right? So if Albania suddenly becomes a full player as a member, and I think they're on track to become a member, they've done everything. And they know very, very shrewdly how to play the system. They'll be in political elite, but Serbia doesn't. You know, that has implications for the other Western Balkans. Croatia is a member, Serbia isn't. That opens up all kinds of, if Belgrade wants money from the EU, it has to be on okay terms with Zagreb. Now, you can think of an alternate reality where none of those states become members of the EU, and you have a different kind of, or Serbia becomes a member of the EU, say, that was unlikely historically, but think about how the power dynamic works. If Turkey wants something from the EU, it has to go through Athens. But it's just a general, just a truism. Everybody knows who does Turkey, Greek Turks. Turkey has to talk to two people, right? Like Berlin, because of that very particular relationship between both societies that goes long before the Second World War, and Athens, right? Athens can block everything related to Turkey. Turkey knows that. So you have this kind of difficult adversarial relationship. Right? So through their access to the European Council, Commission, Parliament, and Central Bank, such states as, again, Eurozone membership, I'll come back to that in a minute, such as Greece and Cyprus can become the center of EU decision-making in those policy areas and regions they view as existential to their interests. Remember, existential to their interests. Your smart EU member state does not always play the veto. Because you do that too often, you overuse that card, people get tired in Brussels and they just start ignoring you or going around you. You make yourself useful and play that game. So there still are asymmetries of power within the EU system, right? So Germany still is bigger and involved in everything and has a degree of greater power and not. So I'm not claiming that there's not a hierarchy within the EU, but the system is still wired to give small states a say. Can you imagine Tatarstan or Primorie vetoing decision-making in Moscow related to their strategic interests? Can you even imagine a policy-making process that conceives of these things in those terms? Actually, one of the strengths of the US system was it had elements of this as well through the Senate, right? And various processes. But what Trump is, we've gradually seen an erosion of these structures actually before Trump, right? So the overuse of executive orders and these kinds of things. And so by expanding reach of the EU single market and Schengen border system, pressure neighboring states that want access to European markets into reordering their own legal and economic systems along frameworks shaped by EU member states that include rivals within shared regions. So this effect doesn't just have an effect on states that want to join, right? It also has a growing impact, market effect, and regulatory effect. We call it the Brussels effect, on other states around these regions, right? The EU, as it constructs a market and a political entity, and maybe increasingly a security entity, but it increasingly concentrates all the main European powers into one bracket, that has enormous political and economic knock-on effects on neighboring states. So what then happens is we have the Brussels effect. So as a consequence, neighboring states have to start rewriting their own regulatory systems to actually gain access to that's the part of the EU's power, is to say, you want access to our markets, you want investment from us, you have to start basically, often we now have like states like Egypt or Tunisia, even under authoritarian regimes, rewrite the economic regulatory framework to match EU regulatory frameworks, even before the EU starts asking. Right? One of those really difficult relations in all of this is Turkey, because Turkey is too big to just entirely be submissive in this. It's a very powerful state in itself. Yet its supply chains, financial system, economic prosperity is based on basically access to EU markets for all the play they make to the Gulf and everyone else. Right? That's why it can play that special role between Russia and the EU in that sense as well. So actually, if you look at the kind of the legal frameworks of the Turkish economic system, it is largely based on the EU model in regulatory terms, from fire safety hazards to manufacturing principles to financial services. And it's all framed within a customs union within the EU. I mean, Turkey doesn't really have an independent trade policy. Right? Once you have a customs to the EU, you have to basically align your trade policy with Brussels. Right? And in that framework, it's not just about like basic diplomacy about Aegean borderlines. You have to go along with Athens. Athens can then, as a local rival, suddenly get in the way of, be really obstructive and get in the way of your negotiation of basic things relating to your own internal economic production. Right? So as the EU expands, it brings all these states in, gives them more power, and doesn't just give them power in terms of the classic sort of security, great power diplomacy with neighboring states. It gives them the power to also blackmail these neighboring states by saying, look, if you bomb our island in the Aegean, we'll just your supply chain. We'll screw your supply chain. Right? So this is how this system works. It acts as a form of deperipheralization for some. It reinforces peripheralization for others. But it's not entirely straightforward, because also, if you as a neighboring state can develop certain relations with the EU, you can also play to its weaknesses. So go through some of these core issues. So managing relations with the neighboring states has always been a central aspect of European integration. This is about timelines. This slide is about timelines. Right? So this isn't a new thing. This isn't a new phenomenon. The EU has always been expanding. I had a friend, you know Mike Kaufman, maybe, who does military analysis. There was a discussion about the EU and what it is and what it isn't. He's never been able to entirely take it seriously, which is very typical of a certain United States analysis community. Maybe have to take it more seriously now, because we may be heading to a rupture between both state systems. So, you know, and he said, actually, he made a good point. He said, well, if you think about the EU as being the one who's expanding and rewiring all these states, who's the revisionist power here? Right? Who's the one who's reordering the system in new ways that sort of maybe, so from a Russian perspective, obviously, this is an expanding power. It's one that they can't quite extract from the United States. So from the Russian perspective, this is still under some sort of US aegis. I think that's also a Russian and American mistake. It's to think that this has no eigendynamic anymore. Originally is very much under US protections. But it has become a commercial and economic rival with the United States. But maybe that's also a reason why it's beginning to break up, this relationship. But there's a kind of an asymmetry and balance in the relationship. The EU is an economic political rival, but supposedly still a security partner. How is that going to last? Right? So we might think that this isn't just about Trump. But to come back to that point, this issue of expansion and managing relations with neighboring states has been a central aspect of European integration from 1957 onwards, from the Treaty of Rivera onwards. It's always been expanding. 1973, mid-1980s, 1995, 2004, 2013, 2015. And now discussion about Ukraine. It's the expanding power, right? So this is very odd slang. This is one of the things that always, in terms of, it's really jarring, in terms of the central periphery dynamic, is the EU is always failing, according to discourse. It's always going to collapse. Yet every time it's about to collapse, it gets bigger. What's going on here? Does this narrative necessarily match? Pressure to adjust to EU institutions for access to a vast market enables the EU system to rewire the structures of neighboring states. And it's been doing this consistently since 1957. If you read Commission documents or member state documents from 1967, 68, it's what do you do with the Greek dictatorship? How do we put it under pressure? If you remember, this Greece was under dictatorship. What pressure can we put on Portugal or Spain because they want access to our markets? How far can we push them in a certain direction? I think within half a generation, all three are member states of the EU and have completely aligned with the EU system. Right? So there's something happening there. Neighboring states can slide from one framework to another. I'm not claiming this is linear. Hungary is a good example. I'm not saying that any of this is a guarantee. This is a dynamic and it's a trend, but under particular circumstances, they can slide from one framework to another, one position to another, and succeed at hitting key benchmarks, develop a lobby among EU member states willing to back their integration. So there's a number of things going on here. First of all, it's not linear. Hungary is a good example. Actually, the moment of key vulnerabilities actually once a state enters the EU, because much of this leverage is lost. But I think the lesson of Hungary under Orban, I think less so with Slovakia and also because people are now watching, is that the moment where the EU actually loses all this leverage is actually just when somebody gets in. Right? Because in that phase, people took it for granted, people assumed Orban knew how to manipulate the system, and we ended up stuck where we are now. People, I think, were more aware when Slovakia happened, Poland happened later, because they'd gone through this experience with Hungary. But also, this is, of course, also not a linear system in terms of the application and process. Albania has a lobby. Now, there's some reasons why maybe Albania should not be taken up in as quickly as possible. Rates of corruption, civil society, a whole set of issues. But Albania clearly has built a strong relationship with Italy, strong relationship with Austria. It has a lobby. So if you're a smart player of this game and build up shared interests with different elements of the system, you can smooth your way into it, or smooth your way into, as in the Turkish case, for a very long period of time, a privileged relationship with it. Right, so again, Erdogan got away with so much because on the one hand, he had these difficulties of Greece's block over the Aegean. As long as he left the Greeks alone, they were fine. And then he built a set of relationships with the German political elite and other European political elites, Austria and elsewhere, by making himself useful, by, particularly during the Syrian civil war, using these border deals to get the EU to back off. He would push this kind of aggressive line through the diaspora as much as possible and then draw back. Right? So he would also use blackmail. So this is not, again, not a straightforward power political story. If we look at the history of peripheries and centers in these periods of state reformation, often groups in the peripheries, once they identify weaknesses in the central actor, still manipulate them and play the game. So this is just basically my insurance slide. I'm saying, of course, I know it's complicated and it's not linear, right? And if we then focus on the Eastern Mediterranean, through the accession of Greece and the Cyprus to the EU, the Eastern Mediterranean become part of this widening of the system, but it also involves many more actors in this process. The reason I think Eastern Mediterranean is interesting is that it actually expands this space into one that creates problems and dynamics that Brussels, the system, has never really anticipated. If we see the expansion to the eastern neighborhood, it's a set of staged processes based on the assumption that everybody really, up until you get to the Russian border, can become a candidate member. The problem you have in the southern neighborhood and the Eastern Mediterranean is the attraction of this dynamic begins to hit its wall, right? Because, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with Syria or Turkey becoming a member of the EU, but that's not personally, but that's not an offer I don't think anybody in the EU or any voter most voters will vote for or make. So what makes the Eastern Mediterranean interesting is this offer is active for some, but not for others. Right? This is a general problem you have the southern neighborhood, but this is why the Eastern Mediterranean, you can do this in micro, right? So what the EU then tries to develop to maintain influence, and doesn't do it very well, right? And it comes to some certain final conclusions about how the EU constructs its sphere of influence and where its weaknesses and limitations are. Where does the system stop working, right? Where does it become a source of failure? Is it starts creating these kinds of hierarchies. So there were 4 distinct neighborhood structures. I mean, I could do this for the whole southern neighborhood and Sahel and North Africa, but it's Eastern Mediterranean, you can do it in miniature. Right? So you have associated membership with high institutional integration in the EU system, EA and EFTA structures. This is obviously not in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's always picked out like Norway or Iceland. There's always this idea that, hey, maybe we could keep the Turks happy, or the Ukrainians, by the way, if we just go for single market membership. Give them the full integration offer, but no veto player power. And I think the issue is the EU always thinks this is a really generous offer. But there's a reason why Norway's happy with this. It's because they have a shed load of oil money and generate a degree of strategic autonomy for themselves through that. The Swiss are just the Swiss. They're kind of stuck. They like to play at autonomy and neutrality, but they can't really do anything without the EU because the EU surrounds it. And then you kind of run out of different places where the EA and EFTA, even Iceland now wants to join. Right? So this very specific model, I mean, the single market model in the UK is, again, this debate, like this whole debate about, well, maybe we should just go for EA and EFTA membership. And the moment then British voters and politicians then look at it and say, actually, we have no veto player power, and we can have this stuff, it's called fax democracy, right? You have your own regulations and orders faxed to you, and you have very little leverage because once you're in the system, you can't get out. This model that's always sold to the EU, to the Turks or other actors in the Eastern Mediterranean, usually falls apart. But that's the closest you get without having veto player power. Right? And the EU's misunderstanding is always to say, hey, if this works with the Swiss and Norwegians, this will work with everyone else. But obviously, if you don't have veto player power, the whole attraction of the process falls apart. After that, you have stabilization and association states who are candidates for the accession to the EU, struggling to meet the EU's Copenhagen accession criteria. Right, so states such as Albania and North Macedonia have high integration, but with also high oversight from the EU system. Now, you'd think the candidate status should be at the highest tier, but what Switzerland and Norway don't have is the level of oversight you have with candidate status. So if you're in candidate status, I think Ukraine is experiencing this now, actually you're more constrained geopolitically and politically in your internal development than if you're Norway or Switzerland. Norway and Switzerland is a deal, it's done. That's why the British kind of want this, but kind of don't want it. It's just we'll have to see where the country makes up its mind. Because then the EU leaves you alone, right? There's certain areas you share, so they leave you alone, right? That's actually a really sweet deal if you can live with the fact that part of your laws aren't written by Brussels. Actually, once you're a candidate, you're constantly looked over your shoulder. Right? Every aspect of what you do has to pass a test. And that actually means that I tend to view this status is actually less attractive in some ways. If you're a permanent candidate, I think Serbia is a case in point and others. If you're permanently stuck in candidacy status and neither land yourself in single market or in membership, it's really not a nice place to be politically. Also in terms of disappointments to publics. If 3, you have deep and comprehensive partnerships. They contain extensive integration with state-specific structures. So it's variable integration with DCFTA. That's mostly usually because the EU doesn't want to integrate you more. So actually, the Ukrainian DCFTA with Ukraine was not actually a very good deal for Ukraine. The Ukrainians grabbed onto it because that was a way of latching onto the EU system, hoping to hook onto more, which could have worked. Well, it did work in the end. It's membership, but it could have worked without the millions of debt, hundreds of thousands of debt, right? But these are actually also models that were used with Tunisia unsuccessfully. They proposed Algeria. Morocco was kind of in this kind of framework. So that's 3 is what you call variable integration. Right, so the EU doesn't offer you partial access, but holds a little bit back to keep you managed. Right? And then finally, you have neighborhood development international NDIC instruments. Right, that's where you have sort of limited cooperation agreements over different areas, but where basically the EU as a market actor is hegemonic. Right, that's with countries like Egypt, Palestine. Israel actually has a DCFTA with the EU as well. Right, so actually, reason I'm going on in some detail is you can move between these tiers. And the EU moves between these tiers. But you can also move from one tier to another if you build up enough of a support network from the EU. But these tiers and these systems also offer states on the other side of that line, like Turkey in particular, levers through which they can also influence the EU system in their own interest. Right? So 2 core points. Where does the EU system able to exert its maximum control and power as a sphere of influence? It's 1 and 2. What does it really struggle? It's 3 and 4. Because it comes down to, if you don't offer full access, at least, or candidacy, the EU's leverage is very, very limited. Right? Actually, it comes back to discussions we could have about the EU-Russia relationship. But the EU never went out and said, it was always supposed to be special. Now, I think there are very good reasons why the EU did not offer Russia full access. On the other hand, in never, ever even suggesting that offer was possible, it did actually remove a lever. Right? The only way the EU develops is full leverage over a neighboring state is when it offers candidacy or full access. Take that offer off the table, and the offer is not attractive enough. Right? So this is also candidacy, accession. It's not some side project. It's fundamental to the way in which it wields power and wields control. Take that away, and your options are much more limited. I think the deterioration of relations with Turkey was clearly when you get to about 2011, 2012, when membership is off the table. Actually, I'm more optimistic about Turkey than others. There's some reasons we can go into that. So I'm running out of time probably, so several variables can affect the stability of this. How these different neighboring states operate within the system. Whether you're periphery, are you going through a process of peripheralization, or you're outside this line, are you integrated to the system? Like, this is not a stable process. So we can think of several crises in the last years that affect us in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere. Migration and border management, which ironically both led to the worst crisis between Turkey and the EU, but also then gave Turkey immense leverage over the EU. right? And you can be outside the system, but sort of intertwined with it, and you can actually develop substantial power of a neighboring state. Governance and rule of law disputes, right? We've had those with Serbia and other states. Territorial disputes with EU member states. Though in a sense, because they're often the most obvious disputes, they're the ones that are best managed because people can usually see them coming, particularly if we look at the gas disputes around Cyprus and elsewhere. Divergent or convergent security priorities, competition for the EU geostrategic rivals. Of course, Russia is an element in all this. In the end, Russia can never match the candidacy offer. But if you don't have that candidacy or accession offer on the table, suddenly Russia can do a lot better in your competition. Why do I think the EU will win in Moldova? I mean, you could solve Moldova tomorrow by basically buying Transnistria. I mean, it would be like a rounding error in EU regional development funding. But the moment they said to the Moldovan elites, you're in, basically, at least single market membership, but broadly you're in. All of these things begin to kick in, and even the Transnistrian elite. I mean, Transnistrian trade is largely with the EU. Right, the sheriff guy is basically run a fantastic con in terms of what's moved back and forth between Transnistria and the EU, in terms of products. And I think the pillows they have that textile factory and so on and so forth. So there's also an opening question about how far Transnistria is playing both Moscow and Brussels. And actually, that game worked really well for 20 years. Right, and the balance of power within the EU's institutional troika of European Parliament, European Commission, Council, and Commission. So you also have different policy areas where you have these different sources of conflict. Some where the UCO decision-making is more central, some where the Commission decision is more central, and increasingly the European Parliament is important. It matters in all of this. So where the Schwerpunkt is, center of gravity is in policymaking, like if there are a lot of MEPs angry with Turkey or angry with Egypt, and this is something where the European Parliament has a say with some social welfare environmental regulations, then Egypt will have a problem. If there's a security issue and it's more about UCO, and Egypt is fine, we'll give them lots of money to make them go away. And the Commission is focused more on border management and other kind of wider issues, right? So again, it depends on who you're dealing with, right? So there's a few contested spaces. I've got Kaliningrad here. I used to use Kaliningrad more as an example, but I think that's kind of gone away with the war. But there's also an interesting space where you could see more and more EU influence over local elites. So I think one of the reasons why after 2014-15 the regime clamps down. Of course, Moldova, Transnistria, we've had some other good examples. You have Morocco, La Linea Ceuta. There's a complex relationship here. And of course, Northern Ireland. So it's not just a lot of what I've discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean also involves a lot of these kind of liminal spaces where you have these different imperial or state systems interacting with another. But it's really, really interesting case of support is where is the EU able to exert imperial influence, and where is that influence more limited, right? And you can see all these different factors I've described as what's the basis of its power, the accession offer, or at least offering full access to the four freedoms. Once it stops doing that, suddenly its ability to control what's happening weakens a lot. Its ability to control what happened in Moldova went way up once it gave candidacy status, as an example. Right, so what is the kind of another variable that's changing these things? So again, this is more for discussion. So what's the impact of elections to the European Parliament? 2024 election weakened dominance of party families that shaped integration since 1992. That's the Social Democrats with the S&D, the Christian Democrats, the EPP, Renew, the Greens, the Liberals, and the Greens. It's empowered, in particular, a group called the ECR, European Conservatives and Reformist Group. This is a bit of a rough description, but the hard right, far right ECR, FDE is part of that. It's the Italian Meloni party. They, I wouldn't call them pro-EU is a bit, I think they're heading to a pro-EU direction, but they're European nationalists. I think they are still anchored in the narratives of their own home countries, but they're increasingly comfortable with the EU as a thing, and are beginning to increasingly view it as a way of pursuing a far-right agenda, right? The ECR, and that's interesting, the ECR is becoming integrated into this mainstream. The ECR, by simply saying, okay, we don't want the EU destroyed, actually want to strengthen it in certain ways because we like this for our racist agenda, they're becoming part of this mainstream. That also means that ECR strengthened anxiety over PFE and ESN, which are the much more Eurosceptic. ESN is smash the EU party family. Means that we have this increasingly monomaniacal focus on border control in the Eastern Mediterranean, really at the expense of most other strategic priorities, which again, disadvantages some neighboring states, bolsters others. And it's also less straightforward because some of these ECR parties have friends on the other side of the border, right? So there are various partnerships and cultural and political partnerships that can be leveraged through the European elections. But I think the big story for me with the election of the European Parliament is the growing power of the ECR as a distinct actor in all of this, and they're going to enter into the mainstream. right? And also the way in which they're guiding part of the far to high right to pro-EU might be a bit far, but a certain valuing of this, but also a militarization, a more nationalist, a more supremacist, a more racial modeling of Fortress Europe. So that's not all good, right? On the one hand, okay, parts of the far right are accepting the EU. That's great. That means it's going to stabilize. On the other hand, part of their agenda is flowing into the system. That may be problematic. The impact of elections in the United States. So I didn't mention the US throughout all of this. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just make this short. One of the problems we have is a lot of the ways in which the EU could build up the soft and economic power isn't soft power. It's quite hard in some ways. But it's building up this power political position on the assumption that the Americans will maintain a security umbrella. Right? The EU has expanded because it didn't have to worry about a lot of stuff the Americans dealt with. What happens if the Americans fall away with Trump? What happens if they become like our enemy, Europe's enemy, with Trump? Right? What happens if, I think a more likely scenario is, so Hegseth, they now denied that it was supposed to be cuts, it's about reallocating funding and all that. But say like one of the foundations of US global power isn't special forces or science fiction, high-tech capabilities. The basic foundation of American global power is the ability to move shit around, right? Through prepositioning, stocks, bases, depots, the power of the US Navy, right? What if the US Navy, by the way, is already in a severe crisis. They have a shipping personnel maintenance crisis. They're in severe trouble. It's another thing. We're focused on the Army and land power side, but on the naval power side, the Americans are in a lot of trouble. What happens if they can no longer just patrol the Eastern Mediterranean? What happens if their global system of prepositioning, their ability to project power quickly is based on having all these bases with huge amounts of depots and tanks already prepositioned to Diego Garcia, Chagos Islands, Mannheim, Poland, they're building one in Asia. So what if that rots away because it's waste? What if they cut that away? That's the classic thing Musk would look at, not understand, cut. What if they can't project power anymore? And the classic problem in the Eastern Mediterranean is a lot of that, if you think of what's happening in Gaza, like everybody hates what the Americans have done in Gaza. On the other hand, the Americans are the security guarantors for all that. What happens if you yank this piece out of that equilibrium? Can the EU step in and replace it? I don't know. They might have to try. This is the only other actor that really can, probably in partnership with Turkey. That would then give Turkey even more power and influence in the EU system. Right? Because you could do this, but probably only if it worked with the Turks. And the Greeks would actually be for that, ironically, despite all the disputes, because they just want quiet. The Cypriots just want quiet. Everybody wants this to go away. The Turks would probably also just want quiet because they got everything they wanted in Syria. Right? But that, and then what does it mean about our relations with Israel? If we become really codependent on Turkey rather than Israel in terms of managing security in the Eastern Mediterranean. These are all questions we don't ask ourselves because the Americans haven't yanked themselves out of it. But I think the trends are getting more and more possible. The Americans just yanked themselves out of this in a fit of absence of mind. And we're sitting there just going, oh, our power there has increased. It's all built on economics and commercial relations and regulations. Who's going to police this? Oh, we have to do it now. Oh, no. I think that's a very, very, very imminent possibility, not just there. Right? And the impact of elections in Germany and other EU member states. So none of this factors at all in German political debate until it has to. But there are a number of interesting factors. Coming back to my diaspora research, Turkish, Kurdish, Greek, and Syrian diasporas are a substantial presence in Germany's political scene, and they vote. So Turkish, Kurdish, and Greek Germans are already a substantial voting group in specific areas like North Rhine-Westphalia. They're part of the political elite. Cem Özdemir, Serap Güler, you can see a number of different figures. Kamatzis for the FDP. Within a generation, half a generation, Syrian Germans will become also part of that. I think it's also not entirely predictable. If the AfD was just a smidgen less racist, the German far right could actually get a lot of these votes. Because there's nobody who hates the new group of immigrants more than the last group of immigrants. But they all have, there are these weird bits in each of the party manifestos that you're like, why is the Green Party spending 2 pages discussing Kurdistan or half a page discussing Kurdistan here? Right, so this diaspora dynamic does affect policymaking towards the region. That should be and it's also a lever for all of these states, either the so-called peripheral EU states or Turkey or so on, to exert influence. And Shara is now hugely popular among the Syrian diaspora, so it gives HTS, the new Syrian government, means to exert influence. The outcomes of Israeli offenses in Gaza and Lebanon did shake the German establishment, but it does not affect long-term commitments to protect Israel. What it has done, though, if we come back to a scenario where the Americans leave, is shaken trust with the Israeli government. The Germans will never abandon Israel, but the trust, I think, is declining with the Israeli security and military and intelligence institutions. Really, it should have happened much earlier. I argue it's happening now. So if you do end up in a scenario where the Americans are yanked out, we have to work with the Turks. The Turks go, yes. And the Syrian government goes, yes, we can give you all this stuff and let's work together. Let's work together, EU. That's going to lead to a potential crisis between the EU and Israel. I think that is coming, and that will really be, I don't necessarily think the German political order is really able to cope with this. And finally, a CDU-led coalition is likely to reinforce trends in EU politics backing Israel and Greece, but it's not anticipating this dynamic, because for the moment, they're focused mostly on border security because of the 2015 migration crisis. That defines how the EU uses it. What at the moment defines how the EU uses its power in the region isn't Russia, isn't Gaza, it's borders, right? So there's actually a strong possibility that the EU will get blindsided by this in the end. So finally, the EU Eastern Mediterranean is a European center and it's a periphery. Obviously, it's a periphery along the borders. None of the EU states, member states along that region, are as powerful as France and Germany, but they have power in the system. And they are central to certain decision-making processes within the system. Same goes for the second part of that question is the states on the other side. Turkey is both peripheral, it's outside the EU system, but Turkey specifically also has enormous power and leverage over it. I actually sometimes make the argument, we might as well just make them a member. It would be easier post-Erdogan, not with Erdogan in power, but post-Erdogan, it would probably be easier just to be honest and say, look, they have this influence over us. Let's just get them in and make him a veto player, but integrate them to bits and use the accession, make a serious accession process, which puts them again under tighter parameters, like that we can make it serious again and guide them through the process nice and slow, with the eventual promise of membership. Maybe it's better if we just do this seriously again. Because right now, it's not really great that they are building up all this influence because they can leverage the weaknesses of the system, yet they don't have to have any of the responsibility of the decisions they make in this process within the EU system. That's like an argument we can make. But also there's other actors in the region outside the EU integration, including all of these that I mentioned, Israel, Lebanon, Palestinian Authority, that can at times seem peripheral, but actually build up substantial influence because once you don't have that power of candidacy, you open up yourself up to all kinds of weaknesses and leverage. Again, this is not a demand for eternal expansion. It's just that where does the EU build up this imperial power? It's over membership. Take that away, it actually has a lot of vulnerabilities. So that's the statement. It's, again, comes back to wider hypothesis about this is a core as a problem process of EU state formation, understanding how its power works, and understanding who influences this process and who is empowered by it and who's weakened by it. So I hope that made some kind of sense. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Questions, please.
Yeah, where are countries like Armenia and Georgia in this list/hierarchy?
I think that's a really good question. I think part of it is I don't want to be too negative about Armenia and EU relations, but the EU only has so much bandwidth and capacity. And if you focus entirely on Ukraine, right, you'll assume that it's entirely consumed by dealing with Russia. The reason that's useful to think of the Eastern Mediterranean is there are other, like, if you old like Frun's military academy stars like strategic vectors, like old Russian like strategic, they're like the EU has multiple strategic vectors. The EU's problem is the Roman Empire's problem, right? It has multiple of these things that it has to manage all the time. And if its bandwidth is already so consumed by handling Ukraine and Turkey, because Eastern Mediterranean is fundamentally about our relationship with Turkey, it comes down to that. And in the Sahel, Libya, which is the other final part of that piece, because that informs relations with Algeria and Morocco. What Armenia and Georgia are suffering from is the EU does not currently have the bandwidth to provide the support that many Georgian civil society activists think it can or should. It doesn't have unlimited power. Take the Americans out of the equation, they have even less. I think maybe if the EU recovers, I think it will eventually get through this and become stronger. It might be too late for Georgia as a result. So I think what the Georgia and that part of the Caucasus is suffering from is simply that it was sort of a main focus for the EU for a while. And I think the EU, unfortunately, made promises it couldn't fulfill at that point in its development. I also understand why Georgians and Armenians wanted those promises at the time. Right? And I don't make the argument for cutting Georgia and Armenia off. I would rather the EU focus it, because I think, and again, it opens up questions again about fundamentally about our relationship with Turkey. If our strategy aligns with Turkey, then Georgia is probably going to be okay long term. I don't know how that works with Armenia because Turkey's relationship with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan also has, the Turks are also kind of a mediator between Azerbaijan and the EU, and they've actually done that, played that game very, very well. it comes back to my argument. I think at some point we just have to make if we want to deal with that part of the Black Sea, we have to deal with the main part of the Black Sea, that's Ukraine and Turkey. Just integrating Ukraine in the current circumstances and all the chaos, the amount of effort that will take, doesn't protect Georgia and Armenia. Right? The other side of that equation in terms of the Caucasus is Turkey. So the EU needs to kind of clarify its relationship with Turkey and generate an incentive set again that brings the Turkey more into Brussels' view as to how that region should be ordered, right? Which opens up difficult questions for Armenia, I think, all of this. Right, that sounds a bit diplomacy. It's also to deal with multi-level security relationships, policing relationships, economic relationships, the customs union, trade, transport, logistics, regional development, and so on. Right, so I mean, I don't want to be so pessimistic. I sound pessimistic. But I just think that the EU right now made a promise and then just got sucked into all kinds of other stuff, some of which, if you're in Georgia and Armenia, is visible to you because you see what's happening in Ukraine. You can understand the importance of Turkey. But if you have a sense of how much resources and bandwidth Libya absorbs, even though it doesn't really hit the headlines, for the Italians, the French, right, the Adriatic states, it's a huge just vector of crap fountain that creates all these problems for everyone. The influence affects both in the Sahel. And you have the Eastern Mediterranean. I just don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say you Georgians, Armenians have to solve this for themselves, but I really don't know how the EU can come in and solve things in the way in which civil society activists right now expect it to. Ukraine had the advantage of having a border with an EU state. So what happened in Ukraine scared Poland immediately because that has immediate implications for Poland and Romania. And then Poland, of course, being a neurologic big partner for Germany. That fed straight, the moment Poland entered the EU, whatever happened in Ukraine could not be kept like that at a distance. If Turkey ever joins the EU, Georgia and Armenia can no longer be kept at a distance. I'm selling the Turkish accession thing. I know it's not happening anytime soon, but I think that's a really fundamental question the EU keeps avoiding. But a lot of these issues, that's the key to a lot of these issues, whether we can create alignment between Ankara and Brussels and so on.
There's also this geography, of course, with Georgia and Armenia, as you mentioned. I think it's actually probably more significant than the Turkish question. But as for, I mean, I think you correctly said that Bulgaria joined. I mean, they joined European identity becomes also Bulgarian. I'm positive. Well, I don't think that Europe is prepared to make its identity more Turkish.
I think this is a question about how. There's two things. So there's my optimist. I may be more pro-Turkish than other people in the room, right? Because I grew up with Turkish people in Germany and Kurdish, and it's part of my Vatican. But I think there's also, if you are in Bulgaria and Greece, there's there's this kind of the memes and the jokes in the West Balkans, like how everybody hates each other but eats the same food and hangs out and gets along. It's like the border guard. There used to be, I think they've stopped it now, but there used to be this border station in Thrace where the Turks, at an appointed time every evening, would get drunk and the border guards would swear at the Turks on the other side, and the Turks would swear back at them, and it was all a big joke. But it was also anyway, like there is within the Western Balkans. There are also substantial Turkish-speaking minorities in the Western Balkans and Bulgaria itself. There is a strong cultural relation. The Ottoman Empire was we can make a philosophical question. The Ottoman Empire was a European empire. It was anchored on the Balkans. The elites of the Ottoman Empire were not recruited from the Arab world. They were recruited from Bulgaria, Kosovo, Albania, European Turkey, bits of Western Anatolia. That's where they came from. So you could, if you were really imaginative, and I think, right, I agree, it's a huge, I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but I think you could, and that also involves Turkey. You'd have to have because that was part of the Turkish cultural identity debate in the 1970s, 1980s. You could make an argument for the Ottoman legacy being a European empire that reached all the way to Vienna and is part of us and not them. I think that, but I know most people in Europe don't think that. But I also think strategically, once we pulled candidacy away as a lever, all of these, it opened up a much bigger space for Erdogan to do what he liked. All of the Europeans have sold us out. Right. So I think, on the other hand, I think there were good reasons why we pulled away candidacy, because it's clearly what was happening after Ergenekon in 2008, and all, the authoritarian drift and the Gulenist. Yeah, I get why that happened. But I think that's, for me, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, Ukraine is the key for the East, Turkey is the key for the South. east, Libya and whatever we do with Algeria and Tunisia is the key to the south. Again, I'm not saying Libya and Tunisia and Algeria will become member states, but again, it's that whole issue of if you can't make that offer, how else do you build these relationships in a way in which the EU can assert its influence and power to kind of get what it wants, which I think often is bad, but usually is actually pretty okay for both sides of the equation. But no, I agree. I don't think it's absolutely. I just think it would be better, and you can disagree. We can sort of have discussion. First, it leaves Russia as an example.
Yeah, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. So there are several questions that come to my mind in this respect. One question, of course, is how the composition of the future peacekeeping European force, which has been debated now, and like this idea of centered periphery and new team. Could you imagine, for instance, that Turkey would be absorbed, would be included in this force, or some other kind of non-trivial conclusions from your ideas?
I think ultimately, we underestimate the extent to which Turkey is already part of the system. That's the point I keep trying to make, and that also gives them leverage. It's a bit like Mexico to the United States, at least before Trump, right? It's a too big to fail neighbor, right? It's so deeply embedded. I think people who don't understand the Turkey-EU relationship don't understand how deeply embedded and intertwined the two sides are. I think what the difference between Ukraine in the 1990s and Ukraine now is something similar has happened between Ukraine and the rest of the EU. And actually, one of the interesting questions that come up is Ukraine has a good relationship with the EU. It's a candidate member and all the rest. But I actually think the EU, if Turkey was attacked and came under existential threat, I think the EU would come under very similar pressures to keep them going for a lot of similar reasons. I don't think that's going to happen because they're powerful enough and they're very, under a democratic government, they would be a good partners. But I think we forget how close both sides are. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a member. You can have like the EEA, EFTA. Maybe that would work. Maybe that would work. There's other ways of maybe constructing this. The trap for Ukraine, by the way, is if we do have a successful EEA, EFTA model with Britain and Turkey, a lot of the EU says, hey, actually, this works with Turkey and Britain. Why would you give them full? They'll have full access, travel and economic and so on. Why give Ukraine veto player status? They're a pain in the ass, but they'll be part of our team, but not full members. They'll be just the substitutes on the substitutes bench. Right? So there's a danger if that actually begins to become a solution for the other big problems, the UK and Turkey, then before Ukraine is a member, then the EU turns around and says, actually, works with Turkey, works. Why not for you? And the Ukraine's like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on, right? We want to be veto players for good reasons, right? But I think if we look at the underlying issues of the war, and this is why if we speak of, I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist about the European Union as a power, right? Short-term pessimist, having sat through the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, COVID, issues in the mid-noughts in terms of EU development and structure. Like, this is like coming back to the point at the start. The EU always moves when it has a gun to its head. It has to somehow get to a point where that's not necessary. It's everybody racks their brains in what they do and the 50% of what I do. And they say, how can we get the EU to build a state and structural capacity to be able to anticipate and preempt problems? That doesn't mean that other states are any better at that. But the EU is particularly vulnerable because it's still in the process of formation. So how can we get better at being prepared and not just getting blindsided over and over again? And we haven't got an answer to that. On the other hand, if we look at the underlying process with Ukraine, I'm a pessimist in terms of, do we get the borders of 1991 back? I don't think we're there. I think there's two wars in that war. I'll come back to themes that we've discussed. There's two wars that were fought, actually. And I still pretty much stand by this. There's a war for the survival of Ukraine as a state, most of it, as a sovereign entity that enters Europe. I think that was won in the first few weeks and months of the war. Then there's a second war after that, I think after Kherson's taken back, November 2022, wasn't it? Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah. There was a second war when Kherson's taken back and when Kharkiv offensive. Like, that's kind of, I think, secures, gives enough buffer. But there's a second war about the future borders of that state, the idea that you cannot rewrite borders. We might lose that, right? That's when we talk about, I think we have to separate in our heads what is won and what is lost. I think Ukraine survives as a state, integrates the EU. We prevented that precedent from happening. But if we cannot prevent the border precedent, then all of these questions, the way in which the EU sets up and expands, it's a gradual process and so on and so forth. If we cannot defend the idea that these borders are inviolable and states as a whole enter the EU or have these relations with the EU, you're setting up this European Union into a much more difficult process of border management. It isn't just about, we have clear lines and defined entities, but where these borders become much more blurred. The whole assumption of the EU method of accession, expansion, and projection is the idea that you have stable borders. Where you have unstable borders, like Northern Cyprus, this stuff gets managed to death, right? And you pour money onto it, and you try to create a stable relationship, and that's like, it's like a wound, and it stabilizes. But after that, those borders are stable, those lines are clear. How does the EU sustain this if, for example, I don't think the Russians are going to take Narva. I don't think they're going to reenact the Fulda Gap, but they can do a lot of stuff with FPV drones, raids, banditry, cause constant chaos. We could put 30,000 Swedish troops, or I think that might eventually happen, in the Baltics, whatever, if the Americans leave. And that would keep the Baltics safe. But what if the Russians just decide to make those borders permanently unstable? Like you have all the time in the Sahel region, right, or other parts of the world. Now, I have a lot of military people say, well, with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, you can always detect this and kill them. That sounds easier than it is in practice on the ground, with guys driving in quickly, blowing shit up. You could go back to an early modern dynamic where the EU controls the Baltics, but you have like a 50-mile radius on either side that is depopulated. Yeah, I think the Russians could do that, and really do that in a way that makes it very, very difficult for us to go all the way. Because we still have protected the Baltics, but they make our borders permanently insecure. And I don't think the EU has the toolbox, or would have to really move very quickly to develop the toolbox to deal with the kind of process where it expands and keeps expanding, but these border issues aren't set, right? Where it expands into areas where these borders aren't clear. And the Ukraine war itself, Ukraine becomes absorbed in some way, yet we will have a permanent sore, like this permanent border that you'd have to patrol with Russia. It's a permanent source of conflict. And there's no situation where, unlike with Turkey, where after this, everybody treats the Cyprus intervention as a bit of an embarrassment. It's like, oops, sorry, Bilincic, fine. And it kind of gets massaged out of the way. Occasionally, there's this saber rattling between both sides, and everybody goes back to making money. I don't see that as an outcome with Crimea, even Donbass, Luhansk, and Moscow. Right? So I think the problem, I think, that arises with Ukraine is this works in a certain way and based on certain sets of assumptions. But if the relationship between the EU and Russia is one where borders are not a clear line, but this zone, I would even say Belarus would be the whole zone. Particularly if after the war, say, all those Belarusians who fought on the Ukrainian side start filtering back into Belarus, which is nothing eminently possible. I think that's where I worry where that heads. Again, you yank the Americans out. Yanking the Americans out of the equation does not mean the Europeans can't defend themselves, but I think they can. I think that a lot of that is panic and anxiety, and some of it's just downright nonsensical. Yes, we have weaknesses, but Jesus Christ, honestly. I mean, there is a degree of cultural cringe towards the United States in that. I mean, we can, we will. Jesus, for God's sake. But it is more of a conceptual problem. Like, how do we deal with borders that don't operate in the way in which we've been used to them being? If it becomes more like the Sahel, right? Our border, that there is no clear line between us and Russia. This is a zone of...
That's precisely from what you said, that borders are so important for the very kind of existence of the state, of any state. Borders are important. And for Ukraine, of course, it's also applicable, right? So like if Periphery is the center, then basically Donetsk is the center, or Donbass is the center of Ukraine.
Kharkiv. Where did Azov come from?
What?
Azov. Where did Azov come from? Kharkiv. Kharkiv is one of the centers. Yeah. I mean, if this becomes this, okay, same like we have a science fiction virtual reality.
But Kharkiv is on this side.
If Kharkiv stays Ukrainian, and Dnipro stay Ukrainian, Zaporizhzhia stay Ukrainian, right? They become these bastions. If you think of an early modern model, you had those fortress towns between Hungary and Austria when the Ottomans, right? And the lords of these marches, like when you mentioned Wales, between Wales, and you have these marcher lords. And the lords of the marches, these people who ran these places, and Tukhanov and Odessa is a classic case in point, who need to be kept loyal and stay loyal, but they get something for it. And they marshal and mobilize local forces who are loyal, but that loyalty to you also increases their leverage towards you. If the EU becomes border systems increasingly dependent on guys like this, not just depending Narva and other places, what do you think the Turks have all this leverage, right? Then yeah, Kharkiv becomes a center in a kind of very early modern sense, right? And a very like, this is a fortress city with a local elite that has its good reasons to stay loyal, but also their sacrifice and suffering means that you have to pose them with cash, right? And like one of the reasons I had problems with the Kursk incursion is I understood why they did it. They needed a political and image win, but you gradually generate a much wider wild fields dynamic. Like Ukraine runs raids into Russia, Russia runs into Ukraine. The EU and UK felt they had to kind of say it was okay, so it becomes part of our approach. And so you remember what the wild fields were, right? You have these zones of depopulated zones of combat, which have developed enormous potentiality for power within the system because you people on our side. I think that's an issue, by the way, which the Putin system, which you will understand far better than I do, is not resolving. Because as long as Putin's in power, he holds the vertical intact. But if you have a kind of a wild fields dynamic between the EU and Russia, then in a weaker leadership, it empowers the local barons. We always have that in Chechnya. Right, so you have some Lord High Duke of Belgorod or Kursk or whoever, because they're the ones holding it for Russia on the other side. Now that works fine as long as the power vertical is intact. Take Putin away and you have a much weaker balance under like President Mishustin or something. And you have these very powerful armed people. That's one of the reasons why they had to shut down the DNR and LNR, right? Because there were elements of that emerging, Chechenization, so to speak, emerging there. But you understand the intricacies of that for the Russian system as well. But if you push this forward to its extremes, I don't think the EU, we'd have to completely reconceptualize how we deal with questions of borders in that kind of environment. That's why I don't want it to happen. Because I think it would be really, really toxic for Russia. I think the EU would survive it and in some ways make it stronger, but it would be toxic for the political culture of the European Union. It would make people like the ECR much stronger. And I'm agreeing, I'm part of the left. Like I believe in a Wehrhafte Demokratie, a democracy that can defend itself, but I'm not a fan of Fortress Europe. Those are two distinct different things in my view. So I think, yeah, it's something to be avoided. I think the Americans yanking themselves the way they are now make it much more likely.
So this idea of wild field, is it something, is it like a third category? So there's center, periphery, and wild field, something like that.
You know what? I think that's an interesting discussion. What happens? Think about the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, so the Russian empires and empires on its borders, where you had these zones. You had these bastions, these fortress towns, and all these spaces in between. People lived in those spaces in between. Well, part of that space between the Ukrainians became the hetmanate.
Some people, unknown people.
Yeah, or they become non-people. Like I don't know. We could really push this further, right? But that would take us in some wild conceptual and theoretical places. I don't know where you'd put that category. Right? I'm still thinking conceptualizing in terms of the idea of, this isn't just for me, I have a colleague called Russell Foster in my department who looks at the EU as a concept of empire. There's a lot of people in the UK. It's interesting how post-Brexit that's become a mainstream, is the EU an empire and stuff, because we're on the other side of it now. You only ever notice the true power of an empire when you're right next to it, not when you're in it. It's like Canadians and Mexicans understand the American empire better than the Americans do. Right? Like Ukrainians understood the Russian empire probably in some ways better than the Russians did. Because you feel it in a way that people inside that space it's like air, you breathe and it's natural, whatever. But you're on the other side of it, you're always watching those guys, right? And it's the same with the Canadian reaction now to Trump's. Too many Americans think that's a joke, right? Canadians are looking at it and thinking this is our nightmare, really coming to life. Everything we've worked for a century and a half to avoid, and maybe he's not joking. Right? And so the Canadians understand this far better than American liberals, progressives do. They think, it's not serious. No, Canadians know it's serious. Because they understand how Mexicans and Canadians understand how these mechanisms work far better than maybe American progressives and liberals that just you float in that water rather than look into it. It's shitty metaphors, but that's where I'm going.
So in Europe, there are countries, in the European Union, there are countries have lost a lot because of this war. See, Austria has lost a lot, economically and politically. But there are some countries that have gained a lot. And the country that has gained more, by far the most, is Greece. So that's your example of.
So is Turkey. And those two parts of the equation are outside the EU, but those two parts, this is the same part of the equation.
This is like your example. You put this as a country that has a kind of has a lobby power that is way higher, way stronger than its actual weight.
Well, also think about Greek shipping. Like they've gotten away with until very recently, they've been able to pull this stunt with using a lot of Greek shipping interests indirectly.
Yeah, and that's how they gain. This is how they gain. They gain.
Norway, that's wrong.
Gas.
Norway with its gas, yeah, but
Poland was military industrial.
Norway is another example. But somehow Greece is kind of more striking, I think, because of somehow it's, I don't know why.
Also, Greece is, I think, the most striking because a decade ago we spoke of Greece as a basket case, right? And this is what I meant about the variable nature of these kinds of dynamics and how center-periphery dynamics can change very radically over a period of time. I remember the discussion in 2012-13 was Greece has to be thrown out of the EU, it's a disaster, it's a basket case, because in the specific policy area in which it trapped itself, it was weakest, it was monetary policy. It's obviously centered very much on Germans, not just Germany, by the way, but several other states within the Eurozone system. The moment the center of gravity of EU policymaking shifts to borders and Eastern Mediterranean trade, and the oil business, by the way, because Greek shipping's role in all that, also Maersk, like global logistics, the Danes are actually important in all of that as well, and MSC, the Italians. Suddenly, the Germans have less power because the Greeks who, to get anything to move in terms of shipping and logistics, the Danes, the Greeks, and the Italians to make these decisions. I think also maybe as a final point, also we need to move on from racial and ethnic stereotypes and all that. Racial less so obviously, but ethnic stereotypes. For example, a state like Italy is central to the entire system. It is in many ways as powerful as the Germans in most key areas, maybe not in monetary policy. Even there, it's very interesting that the Germans and the Commission and the IMF were happy to bully the Greeks. The moment they turned around, the Italians had a number of banks going down. Italians just said, we'll just let them go and screw your entire system, and they've had to pay the Italians off. So I think there are also, I think, other central players in all things. We can't just look at Germany and France. I think it's Italy, Poland have kind of, UK out, Italy, Poland have come into that bracket. So it's also, I think this isn't what this lecture is about, but it's also about redefining who is the central center, who is the center in all things. And it's not just Germany and France. I think it's also now Italy and Poland in these kinds of calculations as well. Partly for the reasons you mentioned, because once you go into the realms of logistics and trade and the Mediterranean being central to oil and gas, then that's a state that has a lot more leverage and power. But it's about thinking about these.
Oil and gas is a big part of this kind of international trade, a major part of it. But Norway, why Greece is more striking than Norway in this respect? Because Norway supplies Europe, Norway supplies Germany, etc. While Greece supplies Russia with money and China and India with oil. So Greece is just a parasite.
Yeah.
Just a parasite. Well,
I think they have gradually.
They organize the shipping.
If you give them stuff, they have become a little bit more restrictive and tougher about this over time. They have extracted a lot from Brussels.
They could stop this trade without an act of war. Like while, say, Denmark or Sweden would have stopped the Baltic trade of oil only by starting war, Navy war. But Greece could have stopped this trade without, just by issuing new regulation.
The power they have in the system means that I think this has gotten more and more restricted, but with every step, the Greeks have extracted a lot from Brussels, even the tiniest steps that get
because of Brussels pressure onto Greece.
So Brussels pressure onto Greece, embarrassment. There are also parts, I wouldn't say Greeks, there are parts of the Greek political system that are not, they're happy to trade with Russia and keep Russia going. They don't want Russian dominance in the Black Sea either, right? So there's same with Turkey. Turkey has a delicate equilibrium. Neither Greece nor Turkey are pro-Russian. They're pro-making lots of money as long as Russia doesn't threaten them. So I think there's also a degree of concern in Athens that does take the situation crisis seriously, but they're trying to play it both ways, They want to make enough money while they can, extract everything while they can, and see where they can go. So they have these things have tightened over time, but I agree with you. Each of these steps has been like pulling teeth.
There is a different factor, which is important. The law of the sea is different from the law of land. And just it's entirely different system of regulations. So basically, what Athens wants is not what the Greek
shipping firms.
say.
Although they can't, I agree with you, it could be sort of much greater pressure. I absolutely agree with you. But I think, again, anyway, this is becoming too specific. I mean, it shows their leverage in the system that it's had to be so tough.
More questions. This talk sort of stimulates entirely new and unexpected questions, I think. Anything? Well, thank you very much. And let's continue over the dinner.
And thank you for the.
Thanks. That's nice.
But you need to update the map. The UK was still part of the